Beyoncé stepped onto the stage that night, feeling the pulse of the crowd like a wave washing over her. The lights were bright, almost blinding, but they felt warm on her skin. The music started, and with it, a burst of energy filled the arena. People cheered, screamed her name, their excitement almost tangible. She smiled, her voice rising with each note she sang, pouring everything she had into the performance. The air was thick with electricity, and it wasn't just from the crowd. Something inside her shifted, a feeling she couldn't explain. The spotlight was on her, as it always had been, but tonight felt different. The show, as flawless as ever, went on. But beneath the surface, there was a quiet weight she carried. It wasn't anything anyone could see, but it was there, pressing on her, pulling at her focus. Her heart beat in rhythm with the music, but her mind kept drifting. She had been trying to ignore the conversation that had taken place earlier that day. It was supposed to be just another moment of preparation, of getting ready for the show, but it wasn't. It had shaken her in a way she didn't expect. The words echoed in her mind, and the more she tried to push them away, the more they lingered. The backstage area was always a whirlwind, staff running to and fro, adjusting costumes, setting up the next act. Everyone was busy, their faces focused, their movements quick and purposeful. But Beyoncé couldn't shake the feeling of being a little lost, like she was on autopilot, going through the motions without fully feeling them. The music continued to carry her, and for a moment she allowed herself to lose herself in it. The crowd didn't know the battle she was fighting inside. To them, she was simply Beyoncé, the superstar, the queen. They didn't need to know the woman behind the performance, the person who sometimes felt vulnerable, just like everyone else. As she moved from one song to the next, her energy shifted. The beats and the crowd's energy were enough to carry her for now. But backstage, as she stepped off stage for a brief break, she felt it again, the weight. Her eyes lingered on her reflection in the mirror for a moment longer than usual. There was a tension in her shoulders, a tightness in her jaw. She could feel the tears just under the surface, threatening to break through, but she couldn't let them fall. Not here. Not now. She quickly wiped her face, touched up her makeup, and straightened her costume. She had moments to pull herself together, to be ready for the next set. There was no room for weakness in this world, at least not the kind that could be seen by others. But in the quiet moments, when the spotlight wasn't on her, she allowed herself a breath, just for a second, and then it was back on stage, back to giving everything to the crowd, who would never know the turmoil that lingered just beneath her cool exterior. The lights blazed as she re-entered the stage, her eyes scanning the crowd. They were waiting for her, and she would not let them down. As the show continued, Beyoncé moved from one song to the next with precision. The crowd's energy was infectious, and her voice never wavered. She was performing flawlessly, but deep down, she could feel the weight of the emotions she had been carrying. It was like a quiet storm brewing inside her, one that she couldn't ignore for much longer. Backstage, the atmosphere was a mix of chaos and order. Staff members hurried back and forth, making sure everything was set for the next act, adjusting lights and checking equipment. Everyone was busy, focused on their roles, but Beyoncé felt strangely disconnected from all of it. She wasn't sure if it was the conversation she had had earlier with Jay's or the pressure of the performance, but something inside her was unsettled. The curtain had just fallen on the last set, and Beyoncé rushed to the side of the stage to catch her breath. She had only a few moments before she needed to go back out for the next round. But it was during these moments of stillness that the emotions started to surface. She closed her eyes for a brief second, feeling the rush of adrenaline slowly leave her body. In the quiet of the hallway, the weight of everything seemed to settle on her shoulders. Rihanna, who had been in the audience, caught sight of her from across the backstage area. She could tell something was off. Rihanna had seen Beyoncé perform countless times, but tonight there was something different in her energy. Without saying anything, she quietly made her way over to her, knowing that sometimes silence spoke louder than words. "You okay?" Rihanna asked softly, standing a few feet away. Beyoncé didn't immediately respond. Her eyes were distant, staring at nothing in particular. She wasn't crying, but there was a sadness in her expression, a quiet vulnerability that she rarely showed to anyone, let alone to someone who wasn't a close friend. After a moment, Beyoncé gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She didn't want to admit it, but she knew Rihanna could see right through her. There was no point in hiding. The world outside might see her as a superstar, a symbol of strength, but in this private moment, she was just a person trying to make sense of her feelings. Rihanna didn't push for more details. Instead, she simply stood beside her, a quiet presence that was somehow comforting. Sometimes no words were needed, and in the world they lived in, understanding the silence between each other was more powerful than any conversation. After a few minutes, Beyoncé took a deep breath, straightened up, and turned to face the stage again. She knew the show had to go on. She couldn't let the audience see what she was feeling inside, and she didn't want to let anyone down. As Rihanna gave her a supportive nod, Beyoncé returned the gesture with a faint smile. With one last look at her reflection, she walked back toward the stage, ready to perform once again. The world outside would never know the struggles she faced in these brief, quiet moments. All they would see was her strength, her poise, and her ability to rise above it all. And that was what mattered. Earlier that day, before the show, Beyoncé and Jay-Z had sat down for a quiet conversation in their hotel suite. It was supposed to be just another routine part of their day. They had both been preparing for the tour, for the performance, but that conversation took a different turn. Jay-Z, the man who had always been a pillar of strength in her life, said something unexpected, something that shook her more than she was ready for. He spoke in a way that was rare for him, vulnerable and unsure. He admitted that he felt lost, not in the way that most people would feel uncertain about a single decision or a moment in time, but something deeper. Jay-Z confessed that he had struggled with finding his own identity beyond their shared life, beyond the public image they had both created together. He said that sometimes he felt as though he was just living in the shadow of everything they had built. Beyoncé listened, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. They were sitting in the bright, open space of the hotel suite, but for a moment, everything felt darker, quieter. She hadn't been prepared for this kind of honesty from him. She had always seen him as the strong one, the person who always had the answers, who knew how to navigate the hardest moments. But now he was opening up about his fears, his confusion. It was a conversation that lasted longer than they had planned, both of them speaking and listening, trying to make sense of everything. At times, there were silences, long stretches where no one knew what to say. Beyoncé tried to understand, tried to offer the right words, but deep down, she felt a knot form in her stomach. It wasn't that she didn't care or that she didn't want to help. It was just that hearing this from Jay-Z, someone she had always seen as unshakable, made her question everything. She had always been the one who carried the weight of their joint success. In the public eye, she was the one who shined the brightest, the one who always seemed to have it all together. Jay-Z had been a partner, a collaborator, but his struggles were often kept in the background. Now she saw him in a new light, a person who wasn't invincible after all. It was a lot to take in, and it left her feeling more uncertain than she had expected. They didn't reach any immediate solutions that day. There was no magic fix to their problems or easy answers to the complex emotions that they were both facing. Instead, they agreed to take things one step at a time, to continue working through their issues, both personal and professional. But even as she nodded and reassured him, Beyoncé couldn't help but feel a weight in her heart. The conversation lingered with her long after Jay-Z had left the room, and as she prepared for the show, it seemed impossible to fully push those thoughts out of her mind. The music played in the background, and she tried to focus. She had a performance to give, after all. But as she adjusted her costume and rehearsed her moves, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything had just changed, and she wasn't sure how to make sense of it all. Backstage, after the last song, Beyoncé moved swiftly through the corridors, heading toward the quiet room for a brief break. She felt her energy fading, her mind spinning with the weight of everything that had happened earlier. The noise from the crowd still rang in her ears, but it was distant now, like a sound from another world. In this small moment of solitude, she could finally let the silence settle around her. She leaned against the wall for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to gather her thoughts. The performance had been flawless, as it always was, but tonight, it felt different. The conversation with Jay-Z had left her unsettled. She had given so much of herself to their shared life, their shared dreams, but now she felt as though she were standing on shaky ground. Everything they had built together seemed so sure, so solid, but now it felt like the foundation might be cracking. The bright lights of the stage still burned in her memory, but the reality of the situation weighed heavily on her. She wasn't just a performer tonight. She was a woman who was facing her own doubts, her own fears. She was used to being the strong one, the one who always showed up and gave everything to the crowd. But now, in this quiet moment, she felt the strain of carrying it all. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from her team, checking in to see if everything was okay. But she didn't answer. Not right away. She needed this time, just a few minutes, to process everything swirling in her mind. She could hear the hustle and bustle of the backstage area around her, people moving quickly, setting up for the next segment, making sure the show went on smoothly. But for a brief moment, none of it seemed to matter. It was just her and the quiet hum of her own thoughts. Rihanna, who had been sitting in the audience, walked over to her. Beyoncé looked up, surprised but grateful for her presence. Rihanna didn't ask any questions. She simply stood beside her, offering her company. It was clear to Beyoncé that Rihanna understood, even without saying a word. Sometimes the best support wasn't about offering advice or trying to fix the situation. It was simply about being there. The two women stood in silence for a moment, each understanding that the pressures they both faced were far beyond what most people could see. They didn't need to talk about the details. There was no need for explanations or justifications. In a world where everyone had expectations and demands, this moment of quiet understanding was enough. Beyoncé finally took a deep breath and straightened up. The break was over, and the next segment of the show was about to begin. She couldn't afford to let the weight of her personal struggles affect the performance. The crowd was waiting for her, and she knew they expected nothing less than her best. With a final glance at Rihanna, who gave her an encouraging nod, Beyoncé stepped back toward the stage. The lights would shine on her again, the music would start, and she would return to the woman the world knew, strong, confident, and ready to give everything she had. As Beyoncé stood backstage, preparing for the next set, she took a moment to collect herself. The music from the crowd seemed distant now, like a hum from another world. The pressure of the performance was still there, but it had faded into the background. There was only one thing on her mind now, getting back on stage and giving everything to her audience. Rihanna was still nearby, watching quietly. She hadn't said much after their brief exchange earlier, but Beyoncé knew that Rihanna understood what she was going through. Sometimes words weren't necessary, just the shared understanding between two people who had been through the same struggles. It was clear to Beyoncé that Rihanna didn't expect her to be perfect or to hide what she was feeling. In a way, that small moment of silence had been the most comforting thing. After a few more moments of breathing and reflection, Beyoncé stood tall. She could feel the weight of everything she had been carrying, but now she was ready to let it go, at least for a while. She couldn't afford to let her personal struggles get in the way of the show. The crowd had come to see a performer, someone who could give them an experience they would never forget. And that was exactly what she was going to do. She glanced over at the crew, who were making last-minute adjustments, and nodded. Everything was set. There was no turning back now. She had a job to do, and she was going to do it to the best of her ability. The music began to build, and she could feel the energy in the room shift. The crowd's excitement grew louder as the first notes of the song played. Bianca walked confidently back onto the stage. The lights hit her as they always did, bright and intense, but she was no longer the person who had stepped off just moments ago. She was the performer now. She was the queen on the stage, and she had a job to do. She could hear the cheers from the audience, and it gave her a burst of energy. The weight of her thoughts was still there, but now it was nothing more than background noise. The music pulsed through her, and her body responded. Her movements were smooth and precise, every step and every gesture done with purpose. The crowd sang along, their voices blending with hers. She lost herself in the rhythm, the beats carrying her, pushing her forward. She was no longer thinking about the conversation with Jays or the doubts that had crept into her mind. For this moment, she was free. The spotlight shone down on her as she moved across the stage. The crowd's energy fed into her own, and it felt like she could go on forever. Each note was a release, each lyric a chance to let go of everything else. She didn't have to worry about being perfect anymore. All that mattered was the music and the people who were there to experience it with her. As the final song ended, the crowd erupted into applause. Beyoncé stood still for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. She had done it. She had pushed through her own struggles, and now she was here, standing in front of her fans who didn't know the weight she had carried that night. They only knew the performance they had witnessed, and that was all that mattered. After the final song, the crowd's cheers seemed to echo long after the last note had faded. Beyoncé stood at the center of the stage, her arms raised in gratitude, soaking in the applause. The bright lights blurred around her as she took a deep breath, feeling the rush of adrenaline slowly leave her body. It was a moment of victory, but also one of quiet reflection. The show had been flawless, and yet there was something about it that felt different. As the lights dimmed and the stage slowly emptied, Beyoncé made her way backstage. The hum of excitement still lingered in the air, but the backstage area was a contrast of quiet hustle. People moved quickly, packing up equipment, checking off lists, and getting ready for the next phase of the tour. Everything was moving forward, but Beyoncé felt like she needed a moment to herself. She slipped into a small room where the soft light from a single lamp created a calm atmosphere. Beyoncé closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, just taking in the silence. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to feel the weight of everything that had been happening. The performance was over, but the conversation with Jay's earlier in the day still lingered in her mind. She hadn't expected to hear him say what he did. Jay's, someone she had always seen as a strong, confident partner, had opened up about his own struggles. It wasn't easy for Beyoncé to hear, but it was even harder to process. She had spent so much time focusing on their shared life, their shared success, that hearing him express his doubts made her question everything. Was she really seeing him for who he was? Was she understanding the pressures he faced too? The room was quiet, but her mind was full. She needed a moment to just think. Everything felt heavier than usual. It wasn't that the performance had been any less than perfect. It was the best one yet. The crowd had loved every second of it. But tonight, something about the quiet moments in between the songs, the moments backstage, had shifted something inside her. As she sat down on the small couch, she took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, letting the tension leave her body. The weight of the world felt a little lighter in this room, away from the spotlight. She could finally let herself feel vulnerable. The door creaked open slightly, and Rihanna's head peeked in. She gave a small smile, clearly aware that Beyoncé needed space, but also that it was time to check in. "You good?" she asked softly. Beyoncé looked up and smiled back, grateful for her friend's presence. "Yeah," she replied quietly, "just thinking." Rihanna stepped into the room, leaning against the doorframe. Sometimes it helps to just think it through. Beyoncé nodded, appreciating the simplicity of the words. She didn't need any advice or answers right now. She just needed to think, to process, and to take a moment for herself. She had given everything to the crowd, and now it was time to give something back to herself. After a few moments, Beyoncé stood up. The performance was over, but her journey wasn't. She had a lot to work through, but for now, she knew that taking one step at a time was the best way to handle it. The road ahead would have its challenges, but in this moment, she felt a quiet strength. Sometimes, the hardest part was simply allowing herself to take a breath. As the evening continued, the lights of the venue began to dim, signaling the end of another show. The crowd slowly began to filter out, their energy still buzzing from the performance. Beyoncé stood backstage, surrounded by her team and the usual hustle of post-show activity. There was an undeniable sense of accomplishment in the air, but also a quiet exhaustion that weighed heavily on her. She had given everything to the performance, as always, but tonight something felt different. She took a moment to step away from the noise, moving down a hallway that was now mostly empty. The sound of footsteps echoed in the silence, and she found herself walking slowly, her mind racing with thoughts. Even though the audience was still buzzing with excitement, she felt an odd distance from it all. The bright lights and loud cheers felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the conversation that had unfolded earlier with Jay's. The weight of his words had been heavy, and the more she thought about them, the more they seemed to affect her. She had always seen herself as strong, as someone who could handle whatever was thrown her way. But tonight, she felt a crack in that image. Hearing Jay's admit his own struggles, his doubts about their life and his place in it, had shaken her in a way she wasn't ready for. She had always thought of him as the one who held things together, the one who kept everything on track. Now, hearing him express his vulnerability made her question their shared journey. Had they been focusing on the wrong things? Were they both getting lost in the pursuit of success at the cost of their own well-being? Beyoncé stopped in front of a mirror hanging on the wall. She stared at her reflection for a moment, taking in the tiredness in her eyes. The makeup had smudged slightly, the signs of a long day evident on her face. For the first time, she saw someone who wasn't just the performer, the star that everyone admired. She saw a woman who had doubts, who was struggling to figure things out. It was a feeling she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Rihanna appeared around the corner, her presence a welcome distraction. She didn't say anything at first, simply standing beside Beyoncé, offering a silent understanding. "It's okay to not have all the answers," Rihanna said after a moment, her voice soft but firm. "We're all just figuring it out, one step at a time." Beyoncé glanced over at her, grateful for her friend's support. She knew Rihanna was right. It was okay not to have everything figured out. No one did, no matter how perfect they appeared from the outside. They were all just doing their best, learning and growing along the way. "Thanks," Beyoncé replied quietly, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I needed to hear that." Rihanna nodded, her smile matching Beyoncé's. "We all do sometimes." The two of them stood there for a few more moments, letting the silence speak volumes. It was a reminder that they didn't always have to have everything under control. It was okay to pause, to take a moment for themselves, and to allow themselves the space to process. As the night wore on and the backstage area slowly emptied, Beyoncé felt a sense of calm begin to settle within her. The road ahead was uncertain, but she knew she wasn't alone on it. With friends and loved ones by her side, she would find her way, one step at a time. The morning after the show, Beyoncé woke up early, the quiet of the hotel room a stark contrast to the excitement of the previous night. The sun had just started to rise, its soft light spilling into the room, casting a warm glow on everything. She sat up in bed, stretching her arms above her head, trying to shake off the lingering fatigue from the night before. Despite the success of the performance, there was still a heaviness in her heart that wouldn't quite lift. As she looked out the window, her mind drifted back to the conversation with Jay's. It had been such a raw moment, one that she hadn't expected, and it left her with more questions than answers. She had always been so focused on their shared goals, on their careers, and everything they had achieved together. But now she found herself wondering if they were both losing sight of something important, themselves. She knew that they both carried immense pressure, balancing their personal lives with the demands of the world around them. But hearing Jay's express his own doubts made her realize just how much they both had been holding inside. It wasn't just about the success or the performances anymore. It was about finding the way to stay true to themselves in a world that constantly demanded more from them. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. She stood up and opened it to find her assistant, who was holding a tray with breakfast. It was a small gesture, but one that reminded her of the people who were there to support her, to make sure she was taken care of. "Good morning, Beyoncé," her assistant said, offering a warm smile. "Good morning," Beyoncé replied, accepting the tray. She sat back down on the edge of the bed, taking a moment to enjoy the simple act of quiet reflection over a cup of coffee. There was something soothing about these little moments. She didn't need to perform for anyone right now. It was just her, alone with her thoughts, and the comfort of a familiar routine. As she ate, her mind continued to wander. She thought about the show, about the fans who had come to see her, about the energy that had filled the arena. It was easy to get caught up in the demands of being on stage, to focus only on what was expected of her. But she knew deep down that she needed to take time for herself, to listen to her own feelings, to understand her own needs. She finished her breakfast and stood up, walking over to the window. The day ahead was still full of unknowns, but for the first time in a while, she felt a sense of peace. Things didn't need to be perfect. She didn't need to have all the answers. What mattered was taking things one day at a time and allowing herself the space to grow. Beyoncé took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air from outside. The challenges would still be there, but she was ready to face them. With the support of her friends, her family, and herself, she knew she could navigate whatever came her way. It wasn't about being flawless. It was about being real, about being true to who she was. With that thought, she felt a quiet strength return to her. Today was another chance, another opportunity to step forward, one step at a time.